Okay, so here we are diving into the concept of evolution. And what's kind of funny is that students don't really understand the concept of evolution. They understand what natural selection is and the whole concept of survival of the fittest and Darwin and all that, but they really don't understand what evolution means. And there's actually three things that we are going to talk about. Two things in particular right now that what evolution hopes to explain. So the first thing that evolution explains is the idea of common ancestry. And obviously, depending on where you're from and your upbringing, it might be sort of a controversial thing to say that humans evolved from apes. In fact, it's not at all controversial. It is sort of foundational. But I would even go so far as to say that's sort of the least controversial piece there. The reality is that humans ultimately evolved from the first living organisms that existed on Earth, some proto-bacterium that existed when Earth first developed. The second thing that evolution hopes to explain is the incredible diversity of life that we see today on Earth. Now, what you're going to come to find is that those two things cannot be completely separated because it is the common ancestry that leads to the diversity of life, and it's the diversity of life from that common ancestor that allowed it to radiate and become sort of the broad spectrum of organisms that you see on life today, on Earth today. Now, this image that I just imported in here is really nearly impossible to see because it's so incredibly detailed, but it's essentially showing us the tree of life. And oh shoot, it sort of pixelates here. But what I want to point out is that this right here at the very base is that bacterium that I was talking about, the first cell that developed. And you can see how from that we radiated out, we became, a huge number of bacteria, and then the archaea, the eukaryotes, the plants, the fungi, etc., all the way up here. And then you can see at the very top here, we have Neanderthals and humans. So this here, we came about, this fanning out that you see here, this explosion, is fully the result of the forces of evolution. And clearly you understand that it means that we can trace any one of these tips that exist out here backwards in time over billions and billions of years, hundreds of billions of years, all the way back here to that first organism. So pretty cool, this diagram that you can see here. It really truly does show you the branching that exists and the details of what's happening in this process. All right, so the next concept I want to talk about is what does evolution mean, not at sort of the macro scale, but on the micro scale. And for this, what I want us to be thinking about is what we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is the concept of molecular genetics. And we all understand how DNA is going to ultimately code for us as organisms because we are our proteins, which are expressed by the DNA. And very importantly, if you have a change in this DNA, it will slightly change the RNA, which will slightly change the protein. So evolution does act right here. It acts on our DNA. And in fact, if we want to define evolution in terms of our DNA, it's as this, that evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. Now, this is a really important concept to understand here because notice that I'm not saying that we're not even focusing in on the phenotype, what the organism looks like. We're really looking deep into the genes and looking at the changes that exist at the genetic level. Now, of course, that does potentially express itself in the phenotype of the organism. But we really want to be focusing in on the genetic makeup, so changes in those genes. And it ultimately starts off as simple as a mutation where you change a C to an A or a C to a T, etc. One of those point mutations that could have far-reaching effects on the whole organism. So let's then now take our next step into this concept of evolution and look at all the evidence that exists that help to support the concept that there is common lineage, common ancestry, as well as an explanation for the diversity of life and the genetic component that comes into play here. So what we're talking about here is something called macroevolutionary evidence. And the first one of these is something that you learned probably when you were a little kid, if you were ever into dinosaurs and the Jurassic and Pleistocene, etc. And that is something called the fossil record. Now, one fossil all by itself doesn't really tell you anything. It's cool, you see that it's old and everything, but well, again, what we're trying to establish here with evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of an organism over time and common ancestry. Oh, hold on, I gotta take this call. Okay, so the whole concept of the fossil record is kind of a cool thing, and I don't think students really have a true appreciation of what's going on here, but I want you to imagine that at the very top of the layers, hi Lumpy! Boys are the boys. We have layers of rock, and the newest are laid down. These are all sedimentary. Hold on, Stanley. And at the very bottom are those that were weathered away and were laid down a long time ago. So we have the oldest at the bottom, newest at the top, oldest at the bottom. And if you are able to, in sedimentary rock, trap the organism and its hard parts either become calcified or petrified somehow, then what you hope to be able to do is find a complete fossil record of a particular organism. Now, to this point, obviously, we haven't found a complete fossil record. There's lots of gaps, but it's still pretty good stuff. So imagine you have a situation where you have an organism that looks like that in the oldest layer. And in the next layer up, you have an organism that looks a little bit like that, but then has a slight addition to it. So clearly there's a connection because morphologically they look very similar except for one little addition. And then maybe you go up to the next layer and you would see the same sort of thing except more, again, an advancement upon the previous. And then you have something like this. And then at the very top, it has four little pegs coming out of it. So ultimately, you would want to find a complete fossil record for an organism with an organism, the fossils of the organism, represented in each one of these layers as you go up. Clearly, that hasn't happened, but that doesn't mean there isn't some good fossil records there. For example, here are a couple. What I have here is the fossil record for scallops, which I know aren't the most interesting things, but essentially what you're seeing here is exactly what I mapped out below. This is the older layer, and this is the modern layer that you see up here. And if you just look at the shell parts of the scallops, that they slowly change over time, but have enough of a consistency from one epoch to the next that you know that they must be related to each other. So it continues to climb up, as you see through here, until you get to the more modern forms. And then you might have a divergence going on here where you have two separate species at the very top once you get to the modern times. Let's look at another one. All right, and here we have the ancestors of the horse. We have the modern horse here at the very top. And if we look in the fossil record, we find evidence for the ancestors of the horse. And most importantly, you can see that you have a major change in size going on here, even though for the most part, the bone structure stays pretty much the same. So the increase in size from something about the size of a cat to what we have as our current modern horse going on here. So clearly, this is good evidence for the idea that there is a change in the genetic makeup of this population over time. So let's move us to the next one, and that is the concept of homologous structures. This is pretty cool. All right, so what we see with homologous structures is similar to what we see with the fossils, except instead of looking at one population of organism and how it's changing, we look at current organisms that exist right now on Earth today and see how similar they are to one another. And in particular, so a homologue means that they have the same ancestral connection, but they may be very different in terms of its shape today. So when you look at these forelimbs for each of these organisms, which are obviously different from one another, a human and a cat aren't all that similar. Well, they are, but they're not as similar as a human and a chimpanzee. And certainly a bird and a whale you don't think of as being all that closely related until you look at their forearm structures and realize how incredibly closely related they must be. And what this does is it provides evidence to support the concept of common ancestry. Because if you have this same bone that exists but in a slightly different form because of the environmental pressures associated with that organism, and then you have this as the same bone, again, but in a slightly different form because of the different environment, etc., etc. The phalanges are all slightly, but fundamentally, you have these groups of three different sets of bones that are seen in a very broad array of organisms, supporting the idea that there was probably a common ancestor to all six of these organisms that also had this kind of a bone, this kind of a bone, and this set of phalanges that we see here. So again, homologous structures are those structures that show an ancestral connection despite the fact that those structures may be used for very different things in the current organism. Now that is different from another thing that you're going to see, which are called analogous structures. And with analogous structures, it's sort of the opposite of what we have going on here, which is imagine that we have the wings of a bird and the wings of a housefly. Now, clearly they have similarities to them because they're both used because of the same environmental pressures to fly. They both are functionally going to be doing the same thing, so that means physiologically or morphologically they look the same as well. Those are analogous structures, and what analogous structures do is they sort of confound you into thinking that things are more closely related to each other than they really are, because I think you all can understand that a housefly is not all that closely related to a bird despite the fact that they both fly and have wings. So analogous structures are shaped by the environment to look very similar, whereas homologous structures are shaped by the environment to ultimately look and perform very different tasks. All right, so there are actually two more. Okay, that now everybody in the screencast knows that, pal. All right, so there are two more things. One of them is something called ontogeny, and the other one is the molecular evidence that support the concept of evolution. I'm not going to cover these until tomorrow's screencast because I've already droned on long enough, but know that these two things are coming up as the last two of the four macroevolutionary pieces of evidence that support the concept of evolution. Okay, goodbye.